What started as a routine first-class flight from Chicago to Atlanta became one of the most watched episodes in Hidden Truth's history. Sarah Johnson thought she was simply documenting another case of everyday discrimination, a flight attendant's subtle but persistent refusal to provide equal service to a black passenger. She had no idea that her hidden cameras would capture not just 3 hours of systematic bias, but the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she believed about justice, accountability, and the possibility of redemption. By the time Flight 447 touched down in Atlanta, a single business card would change 2 lives forever. What happened next defied every expectation and transformed a story of discrimination into something unprecedented, a partnership between victim and perpetrator that would reshape an entire industry's approach to bias. This is the story of what happens when someone brave enough to expose discrimination meets someone courageous enough to own it, and how 35,000 feet above the ground, the most unlikely alliance began to take flight. Sarah Johnson adjusted her small camera equipment one final time, ensuring the angles were perfect. As the host and producer of Hidden Truths, a viral documentary series that exposed everyday discrimination, she had become an expert at capturing authentic moments of bias. Her show had garnered millions of views by revealing how people of color were treated differently in restaurants, stores, and public spaces. Today's experiment would take place at 35,000 feet. Sarah had booked a first-class seat on Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta, carefully selecting this particular route because of recent complaints about poor service toward minority passengers. Her production team had installed tiny, nearly invisible cameras in her purse and jacket, designed to capture interactions without drawing attention. The flight was part of a 3-episode series focusing on travel discrimination. Her research had uncovered dozens of stories from black travelers who reported being ignored by flight attendants, questioned about their seat assignments, or treated with obvious disdain, while white passengers received warm, attentive service. As passengers boarded, Sarah observed the crew. The head flight attendant was a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile that seemed to brighten considerably when greeting white passengers. Her name tag read Jennifer Miller. Sarah noticed how Jennifer's demeanor subtly shifted, her smile becoming more forced, her voice slightly cooler. When interacting with the few other black passengers boarding the plane, Sarah settled into seat 3A, arranging her belongings carefully to ensure optimal camera angles. She had dressed professionally, but not ostentatiously. A simple black blazer, minimal jewelry, and her hair pulled back neatly. She wanted to present as a typical business traveler, nothing that would warrant special attention, either positive or negative. The plane filled quickly. Sarah observed Jennifer Miller moving through the cabin, offering newspapers and pre-flight beverages to passengers. She watched as Jennifer stopped at nearly every row, engaging in pleasant small talk with white passengers, laughing at their jokes and ensuring they had everything they needed. When Jennifer reached Sarah's row, the change was immediate and stark. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by a neutral, almost cold expression. Jennifer's eyes briefly met Sarah's before quickly looking away. "Good afternoon," Sarah said politely, offering her own genuine smile. Jennifer nodded curtly without responding, and moved past her to the next row, where she immediately resumed her cheerful demeanor with an elderly white couple. Sarah felt the familiar sting of being invisible, a feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her life, but never quite got used to. This was exactly the kind of interaction she had come to document, subtle enough that it could be dismissed or denied, but obvious enough to leave its target feeling diminished. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah mentally reviewed her plan. She would make reasonable requests throughout the flight, asking for water, requesting an extra pillow, or inquiring about meal options. These were the kinds of simple interactions that should receive prompt, courteous responses regardless of a passenger's race. If her suspicions were correct, she would capture clear evidence of differential treatment. The engines roared to life, and Sarah felt the familiar acceleration as they lifted off from Chicago. Below, the city grew smaller until it disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds. She had flown this route dozens of times for work, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just a passenger. She was an investigator with a mission. Sarah thought about her viewers. Millions of people who watched hidden truths, not just for entertainment, but for validation of their own experiences. In the comments section of her videos, Black viewers regularly shared their own stories of discrimination, often expressing gratitude that someone was finally documenting what they had been experiencing for years. The series had sparked important conversations about unconscious bias and systemic racism in everyday interactions. Several businesses had implemented diversity training programs after being featured on the show, and Sarah had received messages from people saying the series had opened their eyes to prejudices they didn't realize they held. But the work came with a cost. Each episode required Sarah to deliberately put herself in situations where she would likely face discrimination. While the ultimate goal was positive change, the process of documenting bias meant experiencing it firsthand, repeatedly. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers began settling in for the flight, Sarah prepared herself for what was to come. The cameras were rolling, and she was ready to capture whatever unfolded. She had no idea that this particular flight would become her most viewed episode yet, or that it would ultimately lead to changes far beyond what she had initially hoped to achieve. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the familiar sounds of in-flight service began. Sarah could hear the gentle rattling of the beverage cart making its way down the aisle, accompanied by Jennifer Miller's cheerful voice, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. Sarah had been traveling for nearly 2 hours already, having taken an early morning connecting flight from Los Angeles. She was genuinely thirsty, having only had coffee during her brief layover in Chicago. This wasn't manufactured for the cameras. She had a legitimate need that any flight attendant should be happy to accommodate. She watched Jennifer's approach through the reflection in her window. The flight attendant stopped at each row, taking time to explain the available options, making recommendations, and even sharing a laugh with passengers about the airline's new menu additions. Her service was genuinely impressive, attentive, personalized, and warm. 3 rows ahead of Sarah, Jennifer spent nearly 5 minutes with a businessman, helping him choose between different wine options and bringing him extra napkins and nuts without being asked. 2 rows ahead, she complimented a young white woman on her designer handbag and spent several minutes discussing fashion and travel destinations. Sarah pulled out her phone and made a quick note in her voice memo app, speaking quietly. 10:47 a.m. Flight attendant, providing exceptional service to white passengers. Detailed beverage explanations, personal attention, unprompted extras. When Jennifer finally reached Sarah's row, the transformation was immediate. Her shoulders straightened, her smile faded to a neutral expression, and her pace quickened noticeably. She positioned the beverage cart directly in front of Sarah but didn't make eye contact. "Beverage?" Jennifer asked curtly, her voice flat and professional, but lacking any warmth. Sarah maintained her friendly demeanor despite the obvious change in treatment. "Good morning. I'd love some water, please. And could you tell me what juice options you have available?" Jennifer reached into the cart and pulled out a small plastic cup, filling it halfway with water from a pitcher. She placed it on Sarah's tray table without ceremony. "Orange or apple?" Jennifer said, already looking past Sarah, toward the next row. "I'll take orange juice as well, thank you," Sarah replied, noting how Jennifer hadn't offered her the same detailed explanations about beverage choices that she had provided to other passengers. Jennifer poured a small cup of orange juice, placed it next to the water, and immediately began pushing her cart forward. She hadn't offered nuts, crackers, or any of the complimentary snacks that Sarah had observed her giving to other passengers. She hadn't asked if Sarah needed anything else or mentioned any of the premium options available for purchase. "Excuse me?" Sarah said politely, causing Jennifer to stop and turn back with obvious reluctance. "I noticed you were offering snacks to other passengers. Might I have some nuts or crackers as well?" Jennifer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Those are for premium passengers," she said coolly. Sarah glanced at her boarding pass, which clearly indicated her first-class status. "I'm in first class as well," she said, pointing to her seat number. Jennifer looked at the boarding pass, and for a moment Sarah saw something flicker across her face. Perhaps embarrassment at being caught in an obvious falsehood. But instead of apologizing, Jennifer's expression hardened. "We're running low on snacks," Jennifer said. "I need to make sure we have enough for the full flight." This was clearly untrue. Sarah had watched Jennifer distribute snacks generously to other passengers, and they were only an hour into a 2.5-hour flight. She had even seen Jennifer give multiple bags to some passengers without being asked. "I understand," Sarah said graciously, deciding not to push further at this moment. "Thank you for the drinks." Jennifer nodded curtly and moved on to the next row, where her demeanor immediately transformed back to warm and welcoming. Sarah watched as she offered the passengers, a white couple in their 30s, a detailed explanation of all available snacks, ultimately providing them with nuts, crackers, and chocolate, along with recommendations for which beverages would pair well with each option. Sarah took a sip of her water and realized that it was barely lukewarm, while she had observed Jennifer serving other passengers water with ice, often asking if they preferred extra ice or lemon. Her orange juice cup was also noticeably smaller than the portions she had seen Jennifer serve to other passengers. She made another voice memo. "Clear differential treatment, minimal service, no snacks offered, despite first-class status. Smaller portions, no ice offered. Flight attendant gave false information about snack availability." Looking around the cabin, Sarah counted 3 other black passengers, all in economy class. She made a mental note to observe how they were treated during the service. If the pattern held, she expected they would receive similar dismissive treatment. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was sitting in first class, likely having paid more for her ticket than most other passengers, yet receiving demonstrably worse service than those around her. This was exactly the kind of everyday discrimination that her show was designed to expose. Behavior that was subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence by those who didn't experience it, but obvious enough to be deeply hurtful to those who did. Sarah settled back into her seat, knowing that this was just the beginning. She would need multiple clear examples of differential treatment to make a compelling case. Based on what she had already observed, she was confident that more opportunities would present themselves before the flight ended. She just hoped her cameras were capturing everything clearly. An hour into the flight, the meal service began, and Sarah watched Jennifer Miller's routine with growing fascination and dismay. The flight attendant's differential treatment had evolved from subtle to blatant, creating a clear pattern that would be impossible to dismiss, Sarah observed as Jennifer approached each row with a warm smile and detailed explanations for white passengers. She would kneel beside their seats, speaking in low, friendly tones about the meal options. "We have a lovely herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables, or a vegetarian pasta primavera with fresh basil. The chicken is particularly good today. Our chef really outdid himself. Which would you prefer?" She would wait patiently for passengers to decide, offer recommendations based on their preferences, and even share personal anecdotes about the meals. "I tried the pasta yesterday, and it's surprisingly flavorful for airline food," she told one passenger with a laugh. When Jennifer finally reached Sarah's row, the transformation was jarring. She stood stiffly beside the cart, not bothering to kneel or lean in closer, chicken or pasta, she stated flatly, holding 2 pre-packaged meals without offering any description or recommendation. "Could you tell me a bit about each option?" Sarah asked pleasantly, maintaining the same polite tone she had used throughout the flight. Jennifer sighed, barely concealing her irritation. Chicken with vegetables, pasta with sauce. Her descriptions were deliberately minimal, lacking any of the enthusiasm or detail she had provided to other passengers just moments before. "The chicken sounds wonderful, thank you," Sarah said, accepting the meal with a smile. Jennifer placed the tray on Sarah's table without ceremony and immediately began to move on. Sarah noticed that, unlike with other passengers, Jennifer hadn't offered her a choice of beverages to accompany the meal, hadn't provided extra napkins, and hadn't mentioned the complimentary wine service that she had enthusiastically described. To nearly everyone else. "Excuse me," Sarah said politely. "I'd love a glass of wine with lunch if that's possible." Jennifer stopped, her shoulders tensing visibly. "What kind?" she asked without turning around fully. "What options do you have, Fatus?" Sarah inquired, knowing that Jennifer had spent considerable time explaining the wine selection to other passengers, red or white. The contrast was remarkable. Just 2 rows behind her, Sarah had listened as Jennifer spent 5 minutes describing the nuances between a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet Sauvignon, explaining which would pair better with each meal option. She had even offered a small taste to help the passenger decide. "I'll have the Pinot Noir, please," Sarah said. Jennifer returned with a plastic cup filled about a third of the way with wine. Sarah had observed other passengers receiving proper wine glasses filled to an appropriate level, but she accepted the meager serving without comment. She was building a case, not seeking confrontation. As Jennifer moved to the row behind her, Sarah once again witnessed the dramatic transformation. The flight attendant's voice became warm and animated as she explained the meal options in detail to an elderly white gentleman. She knelt beside his seat, spreading out small portions of each dish on napkins so he could see exactly what he would be receiving. "This is extraordinary documentation," Sarah whispered into her phone. "The differential treatment is so blatant that it would be impossible to explain away as coincidence or personal preference." Sarah took a bite of her chicken and found it actually quite good, despite Jennifer's dismissive description. The vegetables were well seasoned, and the portion was generous. She wondered if Jennifer's poor description was deliberately intended to diminish her enjoyment of the meal. Midway through lunch, Sarah decided to test another variable. She had noticed that Jennifer regularly checked on passengers during their meals, refilling beverages, and asking if they needed anything else. She waited to see if she would receive the same attention. 20 minutes passed. Jennifer made 2 complete rounds of the cabin, stopping at every row except Sarah's. She refilled wine glasses, brought extra bread rolls, and even replaced a passenger's plastic fork that had been dropped on the floor. She walked past Sarah multiple times, making eye contact once, but immediately looking away without offering any assistance. Sarah's wine glass sat empty, and she had finished the small bottle of water from earlier. She watched as Jennifer refilled beverages for passengers who were barely halfway through their drinks, yet continued to ignore her obvious needs. Finally, Sarah pressed her call button. The soft chime echoed through the cabin, and she watched Jennifer's reaction in the reflection of her window. The flight attendant's face showed clear annoyance as she realized the call was coming from Sarah's row. Jennifer approached slowly, stopping several feet away from Sarah's seat. "Yes?" she asked, her tone suggesting that Sarah was inconveniencing her. "Could I get some more water, please? And perhaps a refill on the wine," Sarah requested politely. "I'll see what I can do," Jennifer replied, making no move to actually fulfill the request immediately. Sarah watched as Jennifer continued her rounds, serving other passengers for another 10 minutes before finally returning with a half-filled plastic cup of water. No wine refill was provided, and no explanation was given for its absence. The message was clear. Sarah was not valued as a passenger, despite paying for first-class service. Her requests were treated as burdens rather than reasonable expectations, and she was receiving demonstrably inferior service compared to white passengers in identical seats with identical tickets. Sarah made detailed notes about each interaction, documenting times, specific behaviors, and the stark contrasts in treatment. She knew that when this episode aired, viewers would be shocked by the blatant nature of the discrimination, but more importantly, she hoped it would serve as a wake-up call for the airline industry and for individuals who might not realize the extent of their own unconscious biases. As the flight progressed, Sarah found herself in an almost surreal situation. She had become virtually invisible to Jennifer Miller, existing in a strange bubble where her needs and presence were systematically ignored. What had started as poor service had evolved into something that bordered on deliberate neglect. Sarah decided to conduct a more systematic test. She began timing Jennifer's response patterns, documenting how quickly the flight attendant responded to different passengers' call buttons and requests. The results were startling in their consistency. When a white businessman in seat 2C pressed his call button, Jennifer appeared within 30 seconds, smiling and attentive. When an elderly white woman in 4A needed assistance opening her snack package, Jennifer not only helped immediately, but brought her additional snacks without being asked. When a young white couple in row 5 asked about connecting flight information, Jennifer spent 10 minutes helping them navigate the airline's app and even offered to make calls on their behalf. Sarah pressed her call button 3 separate times during this period. The first time, Jennifer glanced in her direction, made eye contact, and then deliberately turned away to help another passenger. The second time, Jennifer approached, but stopped 2 rows away to engage in an extended conversation about vacation destinations with other passengers. The third time, Jennifer finally came to Sarah's seat after a 12-minute delay. "What do you need?" Jennifer asked, standing with her arms crossed, making no effort to hide her irritation. "I was hoping to get a blanket," Sarah said. "It's gotten quite cold in here." Jennifer looked around the cabin pointedly. "I don't see any other passengers who are cold," she said, as if Sarah's comfort needs were somehow questionable. Sarah gestured toward a white passenger 3 rows back who was wrapped in an airline blanket. "That gentleman has one," she observed. Politely, "Those are for premium passengers," Jennifer replied, using the same false explanation she had given about the snacks earlier. "I am a premium passenger," Sarah reminded her calmly. "This is first class." Jennifer's jaw tightened. "We have a limited supply. I need to reserve them for passengers who really need them." The implication was clear. Sarah's needs were not legitimate, or important enough to warrant a blanket. She watched as Jennifer walked away and, within 5 minutes, offered blankets to 2 other first-class passengers who hadn't even requested them. Sarah pulled out her phone and made another voice memo. "Jennifer Miller has now used false information about item availability twice. She's creating different standards for service based on race. This isn't unconscious bias. This appears to be deliberate discrimination." The most disturbing aspect of the entire experience was how Jennifer seemed to be trying to provoke Sarah into an angry response. Her treatment had become so obviously different that it seemed designed to elicit frustration or a confrontation. Sarah recognized this pattern from other situations she had documented. Some people seemed to take pleasure in creating uncomfortable situations for people of color, perhaps hoping to confirm their own prejudices about difficult customers. But Sarah remained calm and professional. She understood that losing her temper would only serve to justify Jennifer's treatment and undermine the powerful documentation she was capturing. Instead, she continued to respond with grace and politeness, making Jennifer's behavior appear even more unreasonable by contrast. Halfway through the flight, Sarah decided to test whether the discrimination extended beyond Jennifer Miller. She noticed a male flight attendant working in the back of the cabin and decided to see if he would provide better service. When he passed by her row, Sarah smiled and asked, "Excuse me, "Could I possibly get some more water?" The male attendant, whose name tag read Michael Davis, immediately stopped and smiled warmly. "Of course. Would you like ice with that? And can I bring you anything else?" His response was so normal, so professionally courteous, that it highlighted just how abnormal Jennifer's treatment had been. Michael brought Sarah a full glass of ice water along with extra napkins and a small bag of pretzels, treating her exactly as she would expect any first-class passenger to be treated. "Thank you so much," Sarah said genuinely. "That's very kind of you." "My pleasure," Michael replied. "Let me know if you need anything else during the flight." The interaction confirmed that the problem wasn't with the airline's training or policies. It was specifically with Jennifer Miller's behavior toward black passengers. This would make Sarah's eventual complaint much stronger, as it demonstrated that appropriate service was both possible and expected. Sarah observed Jennifer's reaction when she noticed Michael's interaction with Sarah. The head flight attendant's face showed clear displeasure, and she immediately called Michael to the front of the cabin for what appeared to be a tense conversation. Sarah couldn't hear the details, but Michael's body language suggested he was being reprimanded for something. After that conversation, Michael's demeanor changed noticeably when he passed Sarah's seat. He still made eye contact and nodded politely, but he no longer stopped to check if she needed anything. Jennifer had apparently established that Sarah was not to receive normal service, and she was enforcing that standard with her crew. The realization that Jennifer was actively working to ensure Sarah's poor treatment made the discrimination even more egregious. This wasn't just personal bias, it was a deliberate effort to create a hostile environment for a paying customer based solely on her race. As Sarah made notes about these observations, she felt a familiar mix of anger and sadness that always accompanied her work. The anger was productive. It fueled her determination to document these injustices and create change. But the sadness was harder to bear, representing the cumulative weight of countless similar experiences throughout her life. She thought about her viewers who would watch this episode, particularly young black travelers who might recognize their own experiences in her story. She hoped that seeing this documentation would help them understand that they weren't imagining things, weren't being overly sensitive, and weren't alone in facing these challenges. As the flight entered its final hour, Sarah found herself genuinely needing to use the restroom. This wasn't part of her planned documentation. It was a simple biological necessity that would provide another opportunity to observe Jennifer Miller's behavior in a different context. Sarah stood and walked toward the front lavatory, which was designated for first-class passengers. As she approached, Jennifer appeared seemingly out of nowhere, blocking her path with an expression of suspicious authority. "Excuse me, where are you going?" Jennifer asked, her tone suggesting that Sarah was somehow acting inappropriately. Sarah paused, surprised by the confrontational approach. "I was just going to use the restroom," she replied politely, gesturing toward the first-class lavatory. "That's for premium passengers only," Jennifer said, despite having watched Sarah occupy a first-class seat for the entire flight. I'm first class," Sarah responded, maintaining her patience, but feeling genuinely bewildered by the interaction. Jennifer looked past Sarah toward her seat, as if verifying her claim, then back at her with obvious reluctance. "Fine," she said curtly, stepping aside but remaining close enough to make Sarah feel monitored. Inside the lavatory, Sarah took a moment to compose herself. The interaction had been so bizarre, so unnecessarily confrontational, that it felt almost theatrical. She wondered if Jennifer was testing her, trying to see how much discrimination she would tolerate before responding negatively. When Sarah emerged from the restroom, she found Jennifer waiting nearby, watching her with undisguised suspicion. The flight attendant didn't speak, but her presence felt deliberately intimidating, as if Sarah had done something wrong by using the facilities she had paid to access. Sarah returned to her seat and made another voice memo. Flight attendant questioned my right to use first-class restroom despite clear evidence of my seat assignment, behavior becoming increasingly hostile and confrontational. 20 minutes later, Sarah's water glass was empty again. She had been carefully monitoring her hydration throughout the flight, knowing that the dry cabin air and her morning travel had left her genuinely thirsty. She pressed her call button and waited. Jennifer arrived after a 7-minute delay, standing at arm's length from Sarah's seat with obvious impatience. "What now?" she asked, her professional facade finally slipping to reveal open hostility. "Could I please have some more water?" Sarah asked, maintaining her polite tone, despite Jennifer's rudeness. Jennifer stared at her for a long moment, as if the request was unreasonable. "You've had a lot of water already," she said. Sarah was taken aback by the comment. She had consumed perhaps 3 small cups of water during a 3-hour flight, hardly excessive by any standard. She had watched other passengers receive multiple beverage refills without comment or concern. "I'm still thirsty," Sarah said simply, refusing to justify her basic physiological needs. Jennifer sighed dramatically and walked away without responding. Sarah waited 15 minutes, watching as Jennifer attended to other passengers, refilled their drinks, and engaged in friendly conversation. Her own request appeared to have been forgotten entirely. Finally, Sarah pressed her call button again. Jennifer approached with obvious anger, her professional demeanor completely abandoned. "What?" she snapped. "I'm still waiting for that water," Sarah said calmly. "We're preparing for landing," Jennifer replied, which was clearly untrue as the eye. Flight was still an hour from Atlanta, and no landing announcements had been made. "Could I please just have a quick cup of water?" Sarah persisted, genuinely needing hydration, and curious to see how far Jennifer would take her refusal. Jennifer stared at her with undisguised contempt. "You know what? You've been demanding and difficult this entire flight. I don't have time to keep running back and forth for every little thing you want." The accusation was so outrageous, so contrary to Sarah's consistently polite behavior, that several nearby passengers looked up in surprise. Sarah had made fewer requests than most passengers, had been unfailingly courteous, and had never raised her voice or shown any signs of frustration. "I don't think I've been demanding at all," Sarah replied quietly. "I've just been asking for basic service." "Basic service?" Jennifer's voice rose slightly. "I've been serving you all flight. You've gotten drinks, food, everything you've asked for." This was demonstrably false. Sarah had been given minimal portions, watered-down service, false information about availability, and had waited excessive periods for basic requests to be fulfilled. But she recognized that Jennifer was now creating a narrative that would justify her discriminatory treatment. "I understand you're busy," Sarah said, taking the high road. "When you have a moment, I'd really appreciate some water." Jennifer walked away without responding, and Sarah never received the water she had requested. She watched as Jennifer continued to provide attentive service to other passengers, refilling their beverages and checking on their comfort right up until the final landing preparations. The thirst was becoming genuinely uncomfortable, but more than that, Sarah felt the cumulative weight of being treated as less than human for 3 straight hours. Every small denial, every dismissive look, every false excuse had built up into something that felt deeply dehumanizing. She thought about the thousands of black travelers who experienced similar treatment, but had no platform to address it, no way to document it, and no recourse for seeking justice. They simply had to endure the discrimination, pay full price for inferior service, and hope that future flights would be better. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Sarah reviewed her footage mentally. She had captured clear, undeniable evidence of systematic discrimination. Jennifer Miller's treatment had been so blatantly different, so obviously based on racial bias, that it would be impossible to explain away or dismiss. But Sarah also felt a sense of sadness about what this revelation would mean for Jennifer. The flight attendant's behavior had been inexcusable, but Sarah knew that the viral exposure would likely end her career and possibly destroy her life. While the consequences were deserved, Sarah never took pleasure in the personal destruction that sometimes resulted from her work. She hoped that Jennifer might use this experience as an opportunity for growth and self-reflection, though experience had taught her that people caught in such clear acts of discrimination rarely accepted responsibility or sought to change. As Flight 447 began its descent into Atlanta, Sarah Johnson felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and anticipation that came at the end of each Hidden Truths investigation. She had captured 3 hours of consistent, undeniable discrimination, but the real work was just beginning. Now she had to decide how to handle the revelation that would soon change everything. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Around her, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing for landing. Jennifer Miller moved through the cabin with her usual efficiency, offering warm farewells to white passengers while completely ignoring Sarah's presence. Sarah pulled out her phone and made one final voice memo: "End of flight documentation. Subject displayed consistent discriminatory behavior for entire 3-hour flight. Pattern of differential treatment based on race is clear and undeniable. Preparing for revelation phase." She had spent considerable time planning this moment. The revelation was always the most critical part of each Hidden Truths episode. It needed to be dramatic enough to create impact, but not so confrontational as to become purely sensational. Sarah's goal was education and accountability, not humiliation for its own sake. As the plane touched down in Atlanta, Sarah waited for the right opportunity. Jennifer was making her final rounds, thanking passengers for flying with them and wishing them well. When she reached the elderly white couple in row 4, Sarah heard her say, "It's been such a pleasure having you on board today. You've been absolutely delightful passengers." The contrast with her treatment of Sarah couldn't have been more stark. When Jennifer finally approached Sarah's row, clearly intending to pass by without acknowledgement, Sarah spoke up. "Jennifer," she said, using the flight attendant's first name for the first time during the flight. Jennifer stopped, turning with obvious surprise and irritation that Sarah had addressed her so directly. "Yes?" Jennifer asked, her tone suggesting that Sarah was overstepping some boundary. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small business card, extending it toward Jennifer. "I think you should know who I am." Jennifer took the card reluctantly, glancing down at it without much interest. Sarah watched as Jennifer's eyes focused on the text, her expression changing from annoyance to confusion, then to dawning horror. The card read, "Sarah Johnson, host and producer, Hidden Truths, exposing discrimination in everyday life. 15 million subscribers." Jennifer's face went pale as the implications hit her. She looked up at Sarah with wide eyes, then back down at the card, as if hoping the words would change. "I've been filming our interactions throughout this flight," Sarah said calmly, keeping her voice low so nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. "Every request I made, every response you gave, every time you provided different service to me versus other passengers." Jennifer's mouth opened and closed without sound, her professional composure completely shattered. Sarah could see her mind racing, probably remembering dozens of specific instances of discriminatory behavior and realizing they had all been captured on camera. "The cameras picked up everything," Sarah continued. "The false information about a snack availability, the questions about my right to use the first-class restroom, the refusal to provide basic service like water and blankets. All of it. I don't," Jennifer stammered, still staring at the business card as if it might disappear. "Jennifer," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine concern rather than accusation, "I want you to understand that this isn't personal. This is about documenting a pattern of behavior that affects thousands of black travelers every day. What happened on this flight wasn't unique. It was typical. Jennifer finally found her voice. "You were recording me without my permission," she said, grasping for some kind of legal high ground. "I was recording in a public space," Sarah replied. "The airline's own terms of service allow passengers to record their travel experiences, and more importantly, I was documenting discrimination, which is both illegal and against your company's policies." The reality of her situation was clearly sinking in for Jennifer. Her career, her reputation, her life, as she knew it, was about to change dramatically. Sarah had seen this moment of realization many times before, the moment when someone realized that their prejudiced behavior had consequences. What are you going to do with it?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah considered her response carefully. "That depends partly on how you handle what happens next," she said. "My show has always been about education and change, not just exposure. People can learn from their mistakes if they're willing to acknowledge them and do better." Jennifer looked around the cabin, perhaps realizing for the first time that other passengers had noticed their conversation. Several people were watching with curiosity, though none could hear the specific details of their discussion. "I never meant to," Jennifer began, then stopped, perhaps realizing that claiming she hadn't meant to discriminate would sound hollow. Given the clear pattern of her behavior, "Jennifer," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly, "I've been documenting discrimination for 5 years. I've seen people respond to being caught in 2 ways. Some deny everything, make excuses, and refuse to take responsibility. Others acknowledge what they've done wrong and use it as an opportunity to grow. Which person are you going to be?" Jennifer stared at the business card, her hands trembling slightly. Sarah could see tears forming in her eyes as the full weight of the situation settled over her. "I have a family," Jennifer said quietly, "a mortgage, kids in college. If this goes viral—" "Then you understand the stakes," Sarah replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The plane had reached the gate, and passengers were beginning to stand and gather their belongings. Sarah knew she had only a few more minutes, for this conversation before the reality of deplaning would interrupt them. "I'm going to give you my direct number," Sarah said, writing on the back of another business card. "I want you to think very carefully about everything that happened on this flight. Really think about it. Then I want you to call me." Jennifer took the second card with shaking hands. "Your behavior today was unacceptable," Sarah continued, "but it doesn't have to define you. You can choose to learn from this and become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. That choice is entirely up to you." As passengers began filing out of the plane, Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. She paused beside Jennifer, who was still standing in the aisle looking stunned. "I'll be waiting for your call," Sarah said. "I hope you make the right choice." Sarah Johnson sat in the Delta Sky Club at Atlanta's airport, reviewing her footage on a secure tablet while waiting for her connecting flight to Los Angeles. The 3 hours of material she had captured were even more compelling than she had initially realized. The cameras had picked up every subtle expression, every dismissive gesture, and every moment of differential treatment with crystal clarity. She uploaded the raw footage to her production team's secure server and sent a preliminary summary to her editor, Marcus Thompson, who had been working with her since the show's inception. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with his response. "Sarah, this is incredible. Also, incredibly disturbing. The pattern is so clear it's almost unbelievable. How did she not realize how obvious she was being?" That was the question Sarah had been pondering herself. Jennifer Miller's discriminatory behavior had been so blatant, so consistent, that it suggested either complete unconsciousness about her own bias or a deliberate intention to provide inferior service based on race. Either explanation was deeply troubling. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her assistant, Patricia Williams. "Sarah, I've been monitoring social media," Patricia said without preamble. "Word is already starting to spread about something happening on a flight today. Someone posted a video of you talking to a flight attendant, but they couldn't hear what was being said. The speculation is building. Sarah wasn't surprised. In the age of smartphones, it was nearly impossible to have any kind of dramatic conversation in public without someone capturing it. She had noticed a few passengers recording with their phones as she revealed her identity to Jennifer. "How much is out there?" Sarah asked. "Just fragments so far. A few seconds of video showing you handing something to the flight attendant." Her reaction when she read it. "But people are putting together that it's you and that something significant happened." Hidden Truths is starting to trend. This was always the challenging part of Sarah's work, the period between filming and the official episode release when speculation and incomplete information circulated online. It could damage the impact of the final product if too much was revealed prematurely. Patricia put out a statement on all our social channels, confirmed that we filmed an episode today involving air travel discrimination. Say that we'll have a full episode ready within 72 hours and ask people to wait for the complete story before drawing conclusions. "Already drafted and ready to go," Patricia replied efficiently. "Sarah, there's something else. We've already received 3 calls from major news networks wanting to book you for interviews about today's flight." Word travels fast in this industry. Sarah wasn't ready for interviews yet. She needed time to review all the footage, prepare her narrative, and most importantly, see how Jennifer Miller chose to respond to the revelation. "Tell them all that we'll have more information in the next few days. No interviews until we've released the episode." After ending the call, Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the airline's corporate customer service department. This was always a crucial step, giving the company an opportunity to respond appropriately before the episode went public. "Dear Delta Airlines customer service team," she typed, "my name is Sarah Johnson, and I am the host and producer of Hidden Truths, a documentary series that examines discrimination in everyday settings. Today I flew on Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta, where I experienced systematic discrimination from your head flight attendant, Jennifer Miller." She detailed each incident methodically, providing specific times and descriptions of the differential treatment she had received. She attached selected screenshots from her footage as evidence and requested a formal response within 48 hours. The email was professional but firm, giving Delta an opportunity to address the situation proactively rather than simply reacting after the episode aired. Sarah had learned that companies were more likely to implement meaningful changes when they felt like partners in the solution rather than targets of an attack. As she finished the email, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, the number was unfamiliar. "Hello, is this Sarah Johnson?" The voice was hesitant, shaky. "Yes, this is Sarah." "This is Jennifer Miller from the flight. You said I should call you." Sarah was surprised. It had been less than 2 hours since they landed, and she hadn't expected Jennifer to process the situation so quickly. Usually people needed more time to work through the shock and denial before they were ready to have a productive conversation. "Jennifer, thank you for calling. How are you doing?" There was a long pause before Jennifer answered. I'm not good. I've been thinking about everything that happened on the flight, and I can't believe how I acted. I can't believe I treated you that way." Sarah was encouraged by the tone of genuine remorse in Jennifer's voice, but she had learned to be cautious about initial reactions. People sometimes expressed regret immediately after being caught, only to become defensive and hostile once they had time to consult with lawyers or advisors. "What specifically have you been thinking about?" Sarah asked. "Everything," Jennifer said, and Sarah could hear tears in her voice. "The way I looked at you when you first boarded, how I ignored your requests for water, the lies I told about not having snacks or blankets available, the way I questioned your right to use the first-class bathroom. I keep replaying every interaction, and I'm horrified by my own behavior." This level of specific acknowledgement was unusual. Most people, when confronted with evidence of their discriminatory behavior, either denied it outright or made vague apologies without admitting to specific wrongdoing. Jennifer, can you help me understand what was going through your mind during the flight? What made you treat me so differently from other passengers? There was another long pause. Sarah could hear Jennifer taking shaky breaths, clearly struggling with the question. I don't know, Jennifer finally said. I mean, I do know, but I don't want to admit it because it makes me sound like a terrible person. The fact that you're struggling with this suggests you're not a terrible person, Sarah said gently. Terrible people don't feel bad about discriminating, but I need you to be completely honest with me if we're going to have any chance of turning this into something positive. I saw you bored, and I made assumptions, Jennifer said slowly. You were young, black, well-dressed, sitting in first class, and I thought, God, this sounds awful to say out loud, I thought maybe you didn't belong there. Maybe you had gotten upgraded through some mistake, or maybe you were being difficult about your seat assignment. Sarah felt the familiar sting of recognition. These were the same assumptions that black professionals faced constantly. The presumption that their success was illegitimate, that they hadn't earned their place in spaces of privilege. So you decided to treat me as if I didn't deserve the service I had paid for, Sarah said, not accusingly, but as a statement of fact. Yes, Jennifer whispered. And then, when you were so polite, so patient with my terrible service, it made me angry because it didn't fit the narrative I had created in my head. So I kept treating you worse, like I was trying to prove something to myself. This was exactly the kind of honest self-reflection that Sarah hoped for, but rarely received. Jennifer was describing the psychological process of how prejudice reinforced itself, how initial bias led to worse treatment, which then created anger when the victim didn't respond as expected. Jennifer, what you're describing is unconscious bias that became conscious discrimination. The first part, the initial assumptions, happens to a lot of people. The second part, the deliberate decision to continue providing poor service, even when you realized I was a paying customer, that's where you crossed a line. I know, Jennifer said. I crossed a lot of lines, and now my whole life is about to fall apart because of choices I made in 3 hours. Sarah heard both genuine remorse and self-pity in Jennifer's voice. This was the crucial moment. Would Jennifer take full responsibility for her actions, or would she become defensive and start blaming circumstances for her behavior? Jennifer, your life doesn't have to fall apart, Sarah said carefully. But that's going to depend on what you do next. Jennifer Miller sat in her car in the employee parking lot of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, staring at her phone after ending the call with Sarah Johnson. Her hands were still shaking, and she felt nauseous with the realization of what she had done and what was about to happen to her life. She thought about her husband, David, who would be expecting her home soon from what he assumed was a routine flight. How could she explain that she had spent 3 hours systematically discriminating against a passenger who turned out to be a famous documentary filmmaker? How could she tell her 2 teenage daughters that their mother might lose her job for being racist? Jennifer had worked for the airline for 15 years. She had started as a junior flight attendant fresh out of college, worked her way up to senior positions, and had always prided herself on her professionalism. She had received commendations for customer service, had been featured in company newsletters, and had never received a serious complaint. But as she sat there replaying the day's events, Jennifer realized that this wasn't the first time she had provided different levels of service to different passengers. She had just never been caught before, never been forced to confront her own behavior so starkly. She remembered other flights, other black passengers who had received less attention, smaller portions, slower responses to their requests. At the time, she had rationalized these differences as personality conflicts, busy periods, or simple forgetfulness. Now she was forced to see them as part of a pattern of unconscious bias that had become increasingly conscious over time. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Flight landed? When will you be home?" Jennifer stared at the message, unable to type a response. How could she explain this over text? How could she explain it at all? She thought about Sarah Johnson's words, "Your life doesn't have to fall apart." But that's going to depend on what you do next. What were her options? She could lawyer up, deny everything, claim that the footage was taken out of context or edited deceptively. She could argue that she had provided adequate service and that any differences in treatment were coincidental. She could try to paint herself as the victim of an elaborate setup designed to destroy innocent people's lives, but Jennifer knew that approach wouldn't work. The footage Sarah had captured was too clear, too consistent, too damning. Any attempt to deny or minimize her behavior would only make her look worse and ensure that the eventual episode portrayed her in the harshest possible light. The alternative was to take full responsibility, acknowledge her wrongdoing, and hope that genuine remorse and a commitment to change might salvage something from this disaster. It was a terrifying prospect because it meant admitting to herself and the world that she had acted in ways that violated her own stated values. Jennifer had always considered herself a good person. She had black friends, had voted for Barack Obama, had never said or done anything that she consciously recognized as racist. But Sarah Johnson's documentation had forced her to confront the gap between her self-image and her actual behavior. She picked up her phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Again, Jennifer," Sarah answered on the first ring. "I want to do the right thing," Jennifer said without preamble. "I don't know what that looks like exactly, but I can't live with myself if I try to deny what happened or make excuses for it." "I'm glad to hear that," Sarah said. "What are you thinking?" "I want to take full responsibility. I want to apologize. Not just to you, but to everyone who will see this episode. And I want to do whatever I can to make sure this never happens again to me or to anyone else." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Jennifer, that's a brave choice, but I need you to understand what it means. Taking full responsibility publicly will likely cost you your job. It will be embarrassing and painful. Are you prepared for those consequences?" Jennifer thought about her family again, about their mortgage and her daughter's college funds and the comfortable life they had built on her airline salary. Then she thought about the look of patient dignity on Sarah's face as she had endured hours of discriminatory treatment. "I caused this situation," Jennifer said. "I have to be the one to face the consequences. It wouldn't be fair to ask my family to protect me from the results of my own actions." "Okay," Sarah said. "Here's what I'm thinking. What if, instead of just featuring you as someone who discriminated, we made this episode about the possibility of change? What if we documented your journey from unconscious bias to awareness and accountability?" Jennifer felt a spark of hope. What would that mean? It would mean being completely open about your thought process during the flight. It would mean undergoing bias training and sharing that experience. It would mean having honest conversations with Black colleagues and customers about how your behavior affected them. It would mean becoming an advocate for change within your industry. The proposal was both generous and challenging. Sarah was offering Jennifer a path to redemption, but it would require her to be more vulnerable and more accountable than simply losing her job and fading into obscurity. Would the airline go along with something like that? Jennifer asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But I'm planning to present them with the option when they respond to my complaint. They can either deal with this as a typical discrimination case, fire you, issue a generic apology, and hope it blows over. Or they can use it as an opportunity to demonstrate genuine commitment to change." Jennifer realized that Sarah was offering her something remarkable, the chance to transform her worst mistake into something meaningful. It wouldn't erase what she had done, but it might give her actions some positive purpose. "There's something else I need to tell you," Jennifer said. "This wasn't the first time I've treated Black passengers differently. I never admitted it to myself before, but looking back, I can see a pattern. If we're going to do this, I need to be honest about all of it." Sarah was impressed by Jennifer's willingness to acknowledge the broader scope of her discriminatory behavior. Most people, even when caught red-handed, tried to minimize their actions and present them as isolated incidents. Jennifer, the fact that you're recognizing this pattern shows real growth already. That's exactly the kind of honesty that could make this episode genuinely impactful. What happens next? Jennifer asked. I'm going to edit together a preliminary version of today's episode, focusing on the discrimination itself. Then I'm going to contact the airline and propose an alternative approach that includes your journey toward accountability. Whether they're interested will determine how this story ultimately gets told. And if they're not interested, Sarah paused. Then I tell the story as it happened today, and you face whatever consequences come from that. But Jennifer, even if the airline doesn't cooperate, your willingness to take responsibility and work toward change will still matter. It will still be part of your story, even if it's not part of mine. After ending the call, Jennifer sat in her car for another hour, processing everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. She felt terrified, but also, for the first time since boarding Flight 447 that morning, she felt like she was making choices she could live with. Finally, she started her car and drove home to tell her family that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. 3 days after Flight 447, Sarah Johnson sat in a conference room on the 15th floor of Delta Airlines' corporate headquarters in Atlanta. Across from her sat Patricia Hayes, the airline's vice president of customer experience, along with 2 other executives and a corporate lawyer who had been taking detailed notes throughout their meeting. Sarah had been surprised by how quickly Delta had responded to her initial complaint email. Within 24 hours, she had received a call from Patricia Hayes requesting an in-person meeting to discuss the incident. The speed of their response suggested they understood the potential magnitude of the situation. "Ms. Johnson," Patricia said, "we've reviewed the footage you provided, and we want to begin by offering you our sincere apologies for the treatment you received on Flight 447. Jennifer Miller's behavior was completely unacceptable and in direct violation of our company policies and values." Sarah appreciated the straightforward acknowledgement, but she had heard similar apologies from other companies that ultimately proved to be empty gestures designed to minimize negative publicity. "I appreciate the apology," Sarah replied, "but I'm more interested in what Delta plans to do to ensure this doesn't happen to other passengers." Patricia nodded. "We're prepared to offer you significant compensation for your experience, and we want to assure you that Ms. Miller will face appropriate disciplinary action, up to and including termination." "Those are reactive measures," Sarah said. "What about proactive steps to address the underlying problem?" This was the opening Sarah had been waiting for. She pulled out a prepared presentation and placed it on the conference table. "I want to move. Propose something different," she said. "Instead of treating this as a standard discrimination complaint, what if we used it as an opportunity to demonstrate real leadership in addressing unconscious bias in the airline industry?" The executives exchanged glances. The corporate lawyer looked particularly skeptical. Sarah opened her presentation. "Here's what I'm proposing. Instead of firing Jennifer Miller, Delta partners with Hidden Truths to document her journey from unconscious bias to awareness and accountability. We show the discrimination that occurred, but we also show how people and organizations can change when they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths." "You want us to keep an employee who clearly discriminated against a customer?" asked Robert Chen, Delta's Director of Human Resources. "I want you to invest in transforming an employee who has shown genuine remorse and a commitment to change," Sarah replied. "Jennifer Miller made terrible choices, but she's also been more honest about her behavior than anyone I've ever documented. That honesty could be the foundation for meaningful change." Sarah clicked to the next slide, which outlined her proposed approach. Phase 1. Jennifer undergoes comprehensive bias training with experts in unconscious prejudice. we document this process, showing both her initial resistance and her growing understanding of how bias affects behavior. Phase 2. Jennifer has facilitated conversations with Black Delta employees and customers about their experiences with discrimination in air travel. These conversations are filmed to help viewers understand the real impact of biased treatment. Phase 3. Jennifer becomes a trainer herself, sharing her story with other flight attendants and helping to identify and address discriminatory practices throughout the airline. Patricia leaned forward, clearly intrigued despite her initial skepticism. What would Delta get out of this arrangement? You get to be the first major airline to demonstrate that you take discrimination seriously enough to invest in real change rather than just damage control, Sarah said. Instead of a viral video about how Delta employees discriminate against Black passengers, you get a viral video about how Delta is leading the industry in addressing unconscious bias. The corporate lawyer spoke up. This seems like it could expose us to significant legal liability. We'd be admitting that discrimination occurred and documenting our employees' biased behavior. Sarah had expected this concern. The discrimination already occurred and has already been documented. The question is whether you want the story to end with denial and defensiveness, or with accountability and growth. Which narrative do you think will better serve Delta's long-term reputation? Robert Chen raised another concern. What about other employees? If we don't fire Ms. Miller for clear discriminatory behavior, what message does that send about our policies? It sends the message that Delta believes in redemption and growth, Sarah replied. But more importantly, it sends the message that discrimination will be addressed thoroughly and publicly, not swept under the rug. I guarantee that every Delta employee who participates in this process will think twice before treating any passenger differently based on race. Sarah could see that the executives were genuinely considering her proposal, despite their obvious concerns. There's one more element I haven't mentioned, she continued. If Delta partners with us on this project, we'll also document the company's broader efforts to address discrimination. We'll interview leadership about your diversity policies, show your training programs, and highlight employees who exemplify inclusive service. This becomes a story about institutional change, not just individual accountability. Patricia looked at her colleagues, then back at Sarah. This is a very unconventional approach. We'd need to discuss it with senior leadership and probably the board of directors. How quickly do you need an answer? My standard timeline would be to release the episode next week, Sarah said. But if you're genuinely interested in the partnership approach, I'm willing to delay publication for up to a month to allow for proper planning and implementation. And if we decide not to participate, asked the lawyer. Sarah's expression became more serious. Then I tell the story as it happened. Jennifer Miller discriminated against me for 3 hours, and Delta's response was to fire her and issue a generic apology. That's still a story worth telling, but it's not the story that creates positive change. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed the implications of both choices. Patricia finally spoke. Ms. Johnson, assuming we were interested in moving forward with your proposal, what would you need from us? Full transparency and cooperation, Sarah replied immediately. Access to Jennifer's training process, permission to interview employees and executives, and a genuine commitment to implementing changes based on what we discover together. This only works if everyone involved is completely honest about the problems and completely committed to addressing them. We'll need to review this with our senior leadership team, Patricia said. Can we have 48 hours to provide you with an answer? Of course, Sarah agreed. But I want to be clear about one thing. This isn't a negotiation about whether discrimination occurred. The footage speaks for itself. This is a choice about how Delta wants to respond to discrimination when it's brought to your attention. As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. The executives had been more receptive to her unconventional proposal than she had expected. More importantly, They seemed to understand that this situation offered them an opportunity to demonstrate leadership rather than just engage in damage control. Walking back to her hotel, Sarah called Jennifer Miller to update her on the meeting. "How did they react?" Jennifer asked nervously. "Better than I expected," Sarah replied. "They're going to discuss it with senior leadership and get back to me within 48 hours. And if they say no," Sarah paused before answering, "then you'll face the consequences of your actions without the opportunity to show how you've grown from them. But Jennifer, regardless of what Delta decides, you've already started changing. That matters, even if it doesn't become part of my show." "I hope they say yes," Jennifer said quietly. "Not just for my sake, but because I think this could really help people understand how bias works and how it can be addressed." Sarah hoped so too. This approach represented a new direction for hidden truths, moving beyond simply documenting. Discrimination toward exploring possibilities for redemption and change. If it worked, it could provide a model for how individuals and institutions could address bias proactively rather than defensively. But first, she needed Delta to choose courage over caution. 6 weeks later, Sarah Johnson stood in front of a packed conference room at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People headquarters in Baltimore. She had just finished screening the completed Hidden Truths episode, titled "Above the Clouds, A Journey from Bias to Understanding," and the audience sat in contemplative silence. The episode had been unlike any she had previously produced. Instead of ending with exposure and consequences, it documented a remarkable transformation that had surprised everyone involved, including Sarah herself. Delta Airlines had agreed to her unprecedented proposal after 3 days of intense internal discussions. Patricia Hayes later told Sarah that the decision came down to a simple choice. They could either be an airline that fired employees for discrimination and hoped the problem would disappear, or they could become an airline that addressed discrimination head-on and used real examples to create systemic change. The partnership had produced extraordinary results. Jennifer Miller had undergone 40 hours of unconscious bias training with Dr. Monica Washington, one of the country's leading experts on workplace discrimination. The cameras had captured Jennifer's initial defensiveness, her gradual recognition of her behavior patterns, and eventually her genuine transformation into someone who could identify and interrupt bias in real time. The most powerful segment of the episode featured Jennifer in conversation with Marcus Thompson, a Black Delta pilot who had experienced years of passengers questioning his qualifications and authority. Marcus shared stories of being asked to show additional identification, being assumed to be a mechanic rather than a pilot, and having passengers request different crew members based on his race. "I never thought about how my behavior as a flight attendant might contribute to making passengers feel unwelcome," Jennifer had said during that conversation. "I was so focused on what I thought was justified suspicion that I never considered how it felt from the other side." The training process had revealed that Jennifer's discriminatory behavior stemmed from a combination of unconscious bias and learned behaviors that she had never questioned. Dr. Washington helped her understand how societal stereotypes about Black people, particularly assumptions about aggression, entitlement, and legitimacy, had shaped her expectations and responses. But the most remarkable part of Jennifer's transformation was her willingness to share her story with other Delta employees. The episode documented her conducting bias training sessions where she showed footage of her own discriminatory behavior and walked colleagues through her thought process at each step. "This is me refusing to give a first-class passenger water because I had decided she didn't deserve normal service," Jennifer told a room of flight attendants during one training session captured in the episode. "I want you to watch my face in this moment and ask yourself if you've ever had similar thoughts about passengers." The training sessions had been uncomfortable but effective. Multiple employees had approached Jennifer afterward to admit their own biased behaviors and ask for guidance on how to do better. Delta had also implemented systemic changes inspired by the project. They created a bias reporting system where employees could confidentially report discriminatory behavior they witnessed. They established customer service metrics that tracked satisfaction rates across different demographic groups to identify patterns of differential treatment. And they began conducting regular bias training for all customer-facing employees. 3 months after the episode aired, Sarah received an unexpected email from the Airline Passenger Association, a consumer advocacy group. They reported that complaints about discriminatory treatment on Delta flights had decreased by 40% since the episode's release, while customer satisfaction scores among Black passengers had increased significantly. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal. Jennifer Miller had not only kept her job, but had been promoted to Delta's newly created position of Diversity and Inclusion Specialist for Customer Service. She traveled to different hubs, conducting bias training and working with employees who had been reported for discriminatory behavior. "I never thought I'd be grateful for being caught discriminating against someone," Jennifer had said during a follow-up interview 6 months later. "But that experience forced me to confront parts of myself that I had been ignoring for years. I'm not the same person I was on Flight 447, and I hope I never stop growing." The episode had also changed Sarah's approach to her work. She had discovered that documenting the possibility of redemption was more powerful than simply exposing wrongdoing. Viewers responded to the story with a level of engagement she had never seen before, with thousands sharing their own experiences of bias and expressing hope that change was possible. Standing in the NAACP conference room, Sarah took questions from the audience about the episode and its impact. "Do you think Jennifer Miller's transformation was genuine?" asked a woman in the front row. "Or was it just a performance to save her career?" Sarah had grappled with this question throughout the production process. "I think it started as an attempt to save her career," she answered honestly. "But somewhere during the training process, it became something deeper. I've stayed in touch with Jennifer, and her commitment to this work has only strengthened over time. She regularly calls me with questions about situations she encounters and asks for feedback on her training programs." A man in the back raised his hand. "What about other airlines? Have any of them implemented similar programs?" 3 major airlines have reached out about adapting Delta's approach," Sarah replied, "and we're working with the Department of Transportation to develop industry-wide standards for addressing discrimination in air travel." Another audience member asked, "Do you worry that showing redemption might make discrimination seem less serious?" This was Sarah's biggest concern about the new direction of her work. "I think there's a difference between excusing discrimination and creating space for people to change," she said. Jennifer Miller faced real consequences for her actions: public humiliation, intensive retraining, and ongoing accountability. But she also had the opportunity to turn her mistake into something meaningful. I think that balance is important. As the event concluded, Sarah reflected on how much her own understanding had evolved through this project. She had started Hidden Truths with a focus on exposure and consequences, believing that shame and punishment were the best tools for addressing discrimination. The Jennifer Miller story had taught her that accountability and growth might be more powerful than shame and punishment. It had shown her that people could change when they were given both the motivation and the tools to do so. But perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that victims of discrimination could play a role in healing the very people who had harmed them, without minimizing their own experience or accepting responsibility for others' biases. 6 months after the episode aired, Sarah received a handwritten letter from Jennifer Miller that she kept framed in her office. "Dear Sarah, I know I can never Undo the discrimination you experienced on Flight 447, but I want you to know that your decision to offer me a path to redemption changed my life. I think about that flight every day, and I use it as motivation to ensure that no other passenger ever feels the way I made you feel. Thank you for seeing the possibility of change in someone who hadn't yet seen it in herself. Jennifer, as Sarah read the letter one more time, she felt proud of the choice she had made to document not just discrimination, but the possibility of growth beyond it. The story of Flight 447 had become more than an exposé of bias. It had become a testament to the human capacity for change and the power of courageous conversations to transform both individuals and institutions. The episode had achieved everything Sarah had hoped for. It had exposed discrimination, created accountability, sparked institutional change, and demonstrated that redemption was possible when people were willing to do the hard work of confronting their own prejudices. Most importantly, it had shown millions of viewers that while discrimination was real and harmful, it didn't have to be permanent. People could change, institutions could evolve, and even the most painful experiences could become catalysts for positive transformation. Above the clouds, on flights across the country, passengers of all races were experiencing better service, because one flight attendant had been brave enough to admit her mistakes, and one documentary filmmaker had been generous enough to believe in the possibility of change. The story of Flight 447 had ended not with destruction, but with redemption, proving that even in the face of discrimination, hope and healing were possible.